The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the large windows at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. A well-dressed businessman in his mid-30s adjusted his navy blue tie as he walked confidently through the terminal, rolling his carry-on suitcase behind him. His warm brown eyes reflected both exhaustion and satisfaction. He had just closed a major deal that would help his company expand into new markets. The businessman checked his boarding pass one more time. Flight 2467 to Chicago. Departure at 9:45 a.m. Seat 12A. Perfect timing. He'd be back home in time for his mother's birthday dinner. She had been insisting on cooking his favorite dish, despite his protests that she should relax on her special day. As he approached his gate, he couldn't help but smile at the thought of his mom's famous pot roast. The smell of success from his morning meeting, mixed with anticipation for the evening ahead, put an extra spring in his step. He had worked hard to get where he was, rising from a modest background to become a senior executive at a leading tech firm. His parents had always taught him that education and determination could open any door. The gate area was bustling with the usual morning crowd. Business travelers tapped away on laptops, families corralled excited children, and solo travelers dozed in uncomfortable chairs. He found an empty seat near the charging station and pulled out his tablet to review some documents before boarding. When the gate agent called for premium economy passengers, he gathered his belongings and joined the orderly line. The boarding process went smoothly as he made his way down the jet bridge, nodding politely to the flight attendants as he stepped onto the plane. Finding his window seat in row 12, he efficiently stored his carry-on in the overhead bin and settled in. He loved window seats. Something about watching the world from above always gave him perspective on life's challenges. Plus, it reminded him of his childhood dreams of becoming a pilot, though life had led him down a different path. He pulled out the book he'd been meaning to finish, a biography of a famous entrepreneur he admired. The pages were already dog-eared from reading snippets during his busy schedule. Just as he found his place in the chapter, he noticed someone stopping in the aisle beside his row. Looking up, he saw a middle-aged woman checking her boarding pass repeatedly, her expression growing increasingly agitated. She was well-dressed in expensive-looking clothes, her designer handbag clutched tightly against her chest. Something about the way she looked at him made his stomach tighten. He recognized that look. He'd seen it before in stores, in elevators, in parking lots. The woman's eyes darted between her boarding pass and the seat number several times, as if hoping the numbers would somehow change. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she realized they wouldn't. Without acknowledging him, she immediately pressed the call button for flight attendant assistance. Other passengers were starting to back up in the aisle behind her, some shifting impatiently from foot to foot, others craning their necks to see what was causing the delay. The businessman took a deep breath and returned to his book, though the words now seemed to blur together on the page. He thought about all the similar moments in his life, the times he had to stay calm in the face of prejudice, the times he had to prove himself twice as much as others. His father's words echoed in his mind. Success is the best response to ignorance. Those words had guided him through college, through his career, through countless situations just like this one. A gentle voice interrupted his thoughts as a flight attendant approached. She was older, with kind eyes and gray streaks in her hair that caught the overhead lights. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, looking between the standing woman and the seated businessman. The morning that had started so promisingly was about to take an unexpected turn. Little did anyone know that what happened next would not only change the course of this flight, but would also become a powerful story of humanity at its worst and its best. The woman with the designer handbag glared at the flight attendant, her voice sharp enough to cut through the usual airplane noise. "There must be some mistake," she said, waving her boarding pass like a flag. "I paid extra for premium economy. I can't possibly sit here." The flight attendant's practiced smile never wavered as she gently asked, "What seems to be the problem with your assigned seat, ma'am?" The woman lowered her voice to a stage whisper that somehow managed to carry even further than her previous complaints. "Look at who I have to sit next to," she hissed, tilting her head toward the businessman. "Surely you have another seat available, perhaps in the front." Several nearby passengers stopped their settling-in routines, suddenly very interested in their phones or the safety cards, but their stiff postures betrayed that they were listening intently. The businessman kept his eyes fixed on his book, though he hadn't turned a page in minutes. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but today's flight is completely full," the flight attendant replied, her voice taking on a firmer edge. "Your assigned seat is right here, and we need to continue boarding to maintain our schedule." The woman's face flushed red. "Do you know how much I paid for this ticket? I'm a frequent flyer with platinum status. This is unacceptable." Her voice rose with each word, drawing more unwanted attention. A baby started crying a few rows back, its wails mixing with the tense atmosphere. The businessman took a slow, deep breath, his knuckles whitening slightly as he gripped his book tighter. He'd been in similar situations before, but it never got easier. "I demand to speak to the head flight attendant," the woman continued, her designer bag swinging wildly as she gestured. "Better yet, get me the captain. This is discrimination against paying customers." The irony of her words hung heavy in the air. A few passengers exchanged knowing looks, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One young woman, a row ahead, turned around, openly frowning at the scene. The flight attendant maintained her composure, though her smile had completely disappeared. "Ma'am, I need to be very clear. Your options are to take your assigned seat or to leave the aircraft. There will be no seat reassignments, and any discriminatory behavior will not be tolerated on this flight." The woman sputtered, clearly not used to being spoken to so directly. "Discriminatory? I'm not being discriminatory. I just want a different seat. I have rights as a customer." The line of waiting passengers in the aisle had grown longer, and murmurs of discontent were spreading. The businessman finally looked up from his book, his face a mask of dignity despite the humiliation being forced upon him. He hadn't said a word throughout the entire exchange, but his silence spoke volumes. Just then, a new voice cut through the tension, deep, authoritative, and coming from across the aisle. Someone else was about to join this unfolding drama, and the air in the cabin seemed to crackle with anticipation. The morning flight that had started with such promise was about to become something none of the passengers would ever forget. The authoritative voice belonged to an elderly man sitting across the aisle. His weathered face told stories of years gone by, and the veteran's pin on his jacket glinted under the cabin lights. "Ma'am," he called out, his tone firm but measured, "I couldn't help but overhear your concerns about seating arrangements." The woman turned, ready to find an ally, but the look in the elderly man's eyes made her pause. He slowly stood up, steadying himself against the seat in front. The cabin fell eerily quiet, with only the distant hum of the engines in the background. "I served in the military for 35 years, he continued, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "And do you know what I learned? The color of a person's skin never determined their character, their courage, or their worth." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of experience. The businessman looked up, meeting the veteran's eyes with quiet gratitude. Other passengers began nodding in agreement, some even softly clapping. The woman's face flushed deeper, but this time from embarrassment rather than anger. "During my service," the veteran went on, "I fought alongside men and women of every race, religion, and background. We bled the same color, shed the same tears, and shared the same fears. And let me tell you something. When you're in the trenches, you don't care about what someone looks like. You care about their character." A young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, tugged at her mother's sleeve a few rows ahead. "Mommy," she whispered loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, "why is that lady being mean?" Her innocent question cut through the tension like a knife, making several passengers shift uncomfortably. The flight attendant seized this moment to step forward again. "Ma'am, we need to continue boarding. What's your decision?" Her tone was professional, but left no room for argument. The woman gripped her designer bag tighter, looking around at the faces watching her. The support she'd expected to find wasn't there. Instead, she saw disapproval, disappointment, and in some cases, outright anger. Another passenger, a businesswoman in a crisp suit, stood up. "If it helps," she offered, though her tone suggested it wasn't really an offer at all. "I'd be happy to switch seats with you. I'd much rather sit next to this gentleman than someone who judges others based on their appearance." Murmurs of approval rippled through the cabin. The elderly veteran remained standing, his presence a silent reminder of the lessons history had taught us all. The woman's options were rapidly dwindling, along with her misplaced confidence. The businessman hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but his dignity in the face of such treatment spoke volumes. His calm demeanor made the woman's behavior seem even more outrageous by contrast. What happened next would show whether one person's prejudice could stand against the united front of humanity's better nature. The tension in the cabin reached its peak as all eyes turned to the woman, waiting for her response. The tension in the aircraft cabin reached new heights as the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I've been informed of a situation that's delaying our departure. I want to be clear about something. This airline has zero tolerance for discrimination of any kind." The woman's face turned pale as the captain continued. "We celebrate diversity on this aircraft, just as we do in our country. If anyone has a problem with that, we'll be happy to help them find another flight." The other passengers burst into spontaneous applause. The woman stood frozen in the aisle, her designer bag hanging limply at her side. The businessman kept his composure, though a slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. A flight attendant different from the first one approached with a phone in hand. "Ma'am, ground staff is ready to escort you off the plane if you prefer not to take your assigned seat. We need to make a decision now. We're already behind schedule." The young girl who had spoken earlier was watching intently, her eyes wide with curiosity. Her mother whispered something in her ear, and the child nodded solemnly, learning a valuable lesson about right and wrong. The elderly veteran remained standing, his presence a silent guardian of dignity and respect. Other passengers had their phones out, some likely recording the incident. In today's world, moments like these often went viral, serving as powerful reminders of both society's ongoing struggles and its capacity for change. The woman looked at her boarding pass one last time, then at the row of faces watching her. The weight of public opinion was palpable. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. I'll take my seat." As she slowly slid into her assigned spot, the cabin released a collective breath. The businessman briefly looked up from his book, gave a small nod to the veteran across the aisle, then returned to his reading. The veteran sat back down, but not before saying loud enough for nearby rows to hear, "Thank you for making the right choice, ma'am. Sometimes our greatest growth comes from our most uncomfortable moments." Several passengers nearby murmured in agreement. The flight attendants began moving through the cabin again, completing their pre-flight checks. The ordinary sounds of boarding resumed, overhead bins closing, seat belts clicking, quiet conversations continuing. But something had changed in that airplane cabin. A line had been drawn, a stand had been taken, and a community of strangers had come together to say no to intolerance. It was a powerful reminder that sometimes the smallest spaces could host the biggest changes in human hearts. As the plane reached cruising altitude, something remarkable began to unfold in row 12. A middle-aged man from the row behind leaned forward and gently tapped the businessman's shoulder. "I'm in sales too," he said, pointing to the business documents visible on the businessman's tablet. "Those quarterly projections look impressive. Which industry are you in?" The businessman turned slightly, pleasantly surprised by the genuine interest. He explained his work in technology solutions and soon they were deep in conversation about market trends and business strategies. The woman in their row stared straight ahead, her posture stiff, but couldn't help overhearing their discussion about multimillion-dollar deals and global partnerships. Other passengers started joining in. A college student 3 rows back mentioned she was studying business administration and asked thoughtful questions about breaking into the corporate world. The businessman shared advice about internships and networking, his voice warm and encouraging. The elderly veteran across the aisle smiled knowingly as he watched the scene unfold. He shared a story about his own grandson, who had recently graduated and was looking for similar opportunities. The businessman pulled out a business card and passed it to the veteran, suggesting his grandson send in his resume. Even the flight attendants noticed the positive energy radiating from that section of the plane. One stopped by with extra snacks, compliments of the crew, she said with a meaningful smile. Another passenger offered to share his newspaper, and someone else passed along a pack of cookies. The woman who had caused the earlier scene remained silent, but her body language began to change. Her shoulders gradually relaxed, and occasionally she would glance sideways at the businessman during particularly interesting parts of the conversations. The disgust on her face had been replaced by something that looked almost like shame. The young girl who had questioned her mother earlier came back from a bathroom trip and stopped at their row. With the pure innocence of childhood, she handed the businessman a drawing she had made during the flight. It showed stick figures of different colors holding hands under a rainbow. "My mommy says we're all the same inside," she announced proudly. The businessman accepted the drawing with a warm smile, carefully folding it and placing it in his jacket pocket. The woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat, the child's simple wisdom making a deeper impact than any of the earlier confrontations. As the flight continued, the cabin had transformed into a space of connection and learning. What had started as an ugly display of prejudice had become a powerful demonstration of humanity's better nature. People from different walks of life were sharing stories, exchanging ideas, and showing what it truly means to judge someone by their character rather than their appearance. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, causing the drink cart to rattle as the flight attendant made her way down the aisle. The businessman steadied the woman's coffee cup when it threatened to spill, a simple act of kindness that seemed to pierce through the last of her defensive walls. "Thank you," she said quietly, her first words since taking her seat that weren't filled with anger. Her voice trembled slightly, and she stared down at her hands folded in her lap. "And I'm sorry. For earlier. I was wrong." The businessman paused for a moment, considering her words. The entire row fell silent, and nearby passengers tried to listen without being obvious about it. Even the elderly veteran across the aisle leaned in slightly. "My grandson," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "he's been trying to tell me the same things. About how I was raised, about how the world has changed, about how I need to change too." Tears began forming in her eyes. "Seeing everyone here, listening to your conversations about business and family, I realize how foolish I've been." The businessman put down his book and turned to face her fully for the first time. "Change isn't easy," he said gently, "but recognizing the need for it is the first step. Your grandson sounds like a wise young man." A flight attendant passed by, noticing the shift in atmosphere. She smiled warmly and offered them fresh napkins, pretending not to notice the woman wiping her eyes. The veteran across the aisle nodded approvingly, his weathered face reflecting decades of witnessing humanity's capacity for both good and bad. The woman reached into her designer bag and pulled out her phone, hands shaking slightly as she pulled up a photo. "This is him," she said, showing a picture of a young man in a graduation gown, standing with friends of various backgrounds. "He's studying social justice in college. I haven't been very supportive. Maybe it's time I listened to what he's trying to teach me." The conversation that followed was quiet but profound. They talked about family, about generational change, about the courage it takes to confront one's own prejudices. Other passengers occasionally contributed their own stories of growth and learning, creating a remarkable moment of shared humanity at 35,000 feet. The young girl who had drawn the picture earlier peeked over the seat again, this time offering cookies to both the businessman and the woman. "My mommy says sharing makes everything better," she announced with the simple wisdom of childhood. Everyone around couldn't help but smile, recognizing the truth in those innocent words. The plane began its gradual descent into Chicago, the city lights twinkling below like scattered diamonds. The cabin lights dimmed for landing, creating an intimate atmosphere that encouraged reflection. The businessman closed his laptop, having just shared career advice with several interested passengers who had gathered around during the flight. The woman who had caused the earlier scene was now looking through her phone, showing pictures of her grandson's volunteer work at community centers. Her voice carried a new tone of pride rather than the previous prejudice. "He's always telling me to open my mind," she said softly. "I think today finally helped me understand what he means." The elderly veteran across the aisle shared one final story from his military days, about a fellow soldier who had saved his life during combat. "Never got to thank him properly," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I've spent every day since then trying to honor his sacrifice by standing up for what's right." A flight attendant passed through, checking seatbelts for landing. She paused briefly at their row, smiling at the remarkable transformation she had witnessed over the past few hours. What had started as a potential crisis had turned into something beautiful, a moment of genuine human connection and growth. The young girl who had given the drawing earlier was now sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, but her simple artwork remained safely tucked in the businessman's pocket, a reminder that sometimes the purest wisdom comes from the youngest hearts. As the plane descended through the clouds, passengers began exchanging contact information. The college student who had asked about career advice got several business cards. The businessman promised to email the veteran about internship opportunities for his grandson. Even the woman pulled out her own card, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence as others warmly accepted it. The plane bumped gently as the wheels touched down, and a light spatter of rain painted patterns on the windows. The woman turned to the businessman and said, "You know, my grandson has been inviting me to his diversity awareness group at college. I think next time I'll say yes." The businessman smiled kindly. "Sometimes the most important journeys aren't the ones that take us to different places," he replied, "but the ones that change our hearts." As passengers began unbuckling their seatbelts and reaching for their bags, the atmosphere in the cabin felt different from any ordinary flight. The businessman stood up to retrieve his carry-on, and several hands reached out to help him, including the woman who had earlier refused to sit beside him. "Let me get that for you," offered the college student who had spent the flight learning about career opportunities. Others smiled and nodded, a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the plane during boarding. The elderly veteran stood slowly, his experienced eyes taking in the scene with satisfaction. The flight attendants gathered near the exit, their faces showing genuine warmth rather than their usual professional smiles. One of them stepped forward and quietly told the businessman, "Sir, the captain would like to speak with you before you leave." Her eyes sparkled with admiration for how he had handled the situation. The young girl who had given him the drawing was now awake and tugging at her mother's sleeve. "Can we wait to see him talk to the pilot?" she asked excitedly. Her mother nodded, understanding that her daughter was witnessing an important moment. As passengers filed towards the exit, many stopped to shake the businessman's hand or pat him on the shoulder. The woman who had caused the initial confrontation lingered behind, clutching her designer bag differently now, less like a shield and more like an ordinary accessory. "I made a call during the flight," she said, her voice stronger than before. "I told my grandson I'd come to his next diversity event. He cried with happiness." She paused, then added, "Would you consider coming too? As my guest? I think having you there would help me be braver about changing." The elderly veteran overheard this and smiled. Change ripples outward, he said wisely. Today's story won't end at this airport. The captain emerged from the cockpit, his presence commanding respect. He walked directly to where the businessman stood and extended his hand. "Sir," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "on behalf of the entire crew, I want to thank you for showing us all what true dignity looks like." Later that evening, in a cozy Chicago restaurant, the businessman checked his phone and was amazed. The story had already gone viral. Passengers had shared their experiences on social media, and thousands of people were responding with their own stories of transformation and hope. The elderly veteran's words had been quoted countless times. The color of a person's skin never determined their character. People were calling him the guardian angel of Flight 2467. His grandson had already shared the post, proud of his grandfather's stand against injustice. The woman's transformation became a central part of the story, too. Someone had captured the moment she apologized, and her genuine change of heart touched many hearts. Her grandson posted a tearful video response, talking about how his grandmother had just called him about attending his next diversity event. The young girl's drawing found its way online, too. Those simple stick figures holding hands under a rainbow became a symbol of hope. Artists around the world began creating their own versions, each adding their unique touch while keeping the innocent message intact. The Flight Attendants Union shared the story as an example of how to handle discrimination professionally. The airline's CEO issued a statement praising everyone involved and announcing new initiatives to promote inclusivity in air travel. The businessman sat quietly, reading through messages from his mother. "You made me proud today," she wrote. "Your father would have been proud too." He smiled, thinking about how a moment of potential conflict had transformed into an opportunity for change. His phone buzzed with another notification. The college student from the flight had already connected with him on professional networks. The veteran had emailed about his grandson's resume. Even the woman had sent a message, sharing details about her grandson's next campus event. As he finished his dinner, the restaurant owner approached his table. "Are you the gentleman from the flight?" she asked warmly. "Your meal is on the house. We need more stories like yours in the world." The businessman thought about declining, but saw the genuine emotion in her eyes. He realized that sometimes accepting kindness was as important as showing it. He thanked her graciously, leaving the amount of the meal as a tip instead. Walking out into the Chicago night, he pulled out the young girl's drawing one more time. In its childish simplicity, it held the truth that so many adults struggled to grasp. We're all just people, hoping to be treated with dignity and respect. The flight might have ended, but its message would continue to soar.